Hi, Don. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Peter?
I'm just fine. For the folks at home, I'm Peter Railton, a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan.
And I'm
talking to Don Loeb.
That's right.
Who
Associate
is?
Professor of Philosophy at the University of Vermont and former student of yours, Peter.
Well, truth in advertising. Although I guess it's also fair to say that I mostly helped you by giving you views to criticize.
Yes, you did, and that's one reason why we're talking today.
Very good.
You can't imagine how much help that can be sometimes.
Somebody's got to put the view out there so that the idiocy can be undone. So today we're talking about moral realism, for and against.
Yep.
And I should say a little bit at the beginning, perhaps, about how I understand moral realism, which is the position that I'll be defending. And to me, it's useful to begin with a kind of an analogy. Suppose you know someone who's planning a vacation, and you say, gee, you know, it's very nice in the mountains right now. And he says, well, I don't like the mountains. Well, that's fine. Then he can take his vacation somewhere else. He's not really disagreeing with you. You're not really making any argument with him. You're perfectly happy for him to go off somewhere else. Suppose, on the other hand, he's a major coal company, and he's just acquired an important and very scenic mountain in your native state of Vermont, and he's about to bulldoze the top of the thing to get to the coal, and you say, but wait a second, this mountain's very important for recreation and scenery and for the wildlife and so on. He says, yeah, but you know, I don't much like mountains. Then you're not going to say, oh, okay then, make up your own mind, this is just your choice. You'd say, well, that doesn't settle the question. Because what would settle the question is a lot more facts and a lot more interests and concerns than the ones you're taking into account. This is not the kind of question you can settle on the basis of your own interests alone. And in that sense, you're claiming that there's a kind of issue there with a sort of objectivity and a scope that goes beyond anything like a question of personal taste. And this is, for example, the distinction between an aesthetic judgment, a judgment of value, in which you're trying to communicate information to others about what is of value and what is not, where you don't take yourself as being an expert, where you realize that it's possible for you to be wrong, and you can learn from others. There's a common subject matter of concern, and people want to learn your views, if indeed they do, because they think it's going to be informative and relevant to them about things that are of value to discover or experience. So think of the same view in the moral case. In the moral case, we want to say that having an opinion on a given subject is fine, but it's not up to you to decide which interests are involved, what would count as a fair distribution, why it is that certain issues are more vital than others. It can't just be your own preferences or your own sense of what's important to you. Your own commitments aren't sufficient. We think we should be answerable to a higher or a different set of standards when we're making moral judgments. And in that sense, we think there's a domain of considerations, of facts, of reasons, which is not mine or yours alone, which is in a sense impersonal or shared, which might govern not only our behavior but our interactions with the natural world. And in that sense, I want to be a realist about morality. I think moral questions are to be decided by trying the best we can, working together to figure out what those concerns are and how best to meet them, and that there is a fact about better or worse answers to that question. And because these are vital and enduring interests, we've probably learned a lot from human practices about better or worse answers to the question.
And these answers are better or worse not based on the preferences of any particular individual or the attitudes of any individual, even subjected to critical reflection. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's right. And so in that sense, any individual's views are not really criterial for morality. And it's one of the things I think we think is characteristic of moral reasoning, that you have to be prepared to take up a standpoint that's impartial. It isn't just governed by any one particular interest or set of interests. And so in that sense, people often contrast realism with a kind of relativism, in which they think that the right answer to a moral question depends upon individuals' norms or social customs, local practices. And I think a lot of people resist moral realism because they think there's something right about moral relativism, that we should be respectful of other practices and other ways of life. And of course, it's that second thought, the thought that we should be respectful of these and show tolerance and understanding toward them. That's the thought that I would say is the characteristically moral thought, and toward which I think they're themselves evincing a realist attitude. They think there are good reasons on behalf of that have to do with human flourishing and well-being, and they think it's not up to them to decide which to tolerate and which not to tolerate, which to be concerned with and which not to be concerned with. So I would say relativism, although it often is seen as the antithesis of realism, often the relativism that people actually espouse is more like a kind of relationalism. They think what is morally required in a situation depends upon local customs and expectations and mores, which seems to be quite sensible. But they think there are higher order questions about tolerance and humaneness and mutual understanding, about which they have, I would say, a more realist attitude.
So we talked at one point about an example of this involving giving food to somebody with your left hand, right?
Yeah.
As a realist, you wouldn't deny, you would assert, I guess, that it's wrong, at least minimally wrong, to give somebody in India, say, food with your left hand, but not wrong here. But that's not because morality, in some broad sense, differs from place to place. It's because it's wrong in every location to give offense unnecessarily, and
right.
Giving somebody food with your left hand will cause offense in one place and not the other. Have I got you right there?
So it's the higher order principle about respecting others and not showing disrespect for them gratuitously. That's the principle that I would think is actually functioning as the moral grounding for the judgment, and that's what gives it the objectivity that it has, so that it can be seen as a critique of people when they aren't prepared to make those kinds of adjustments to the local customs in order to be respectful of others.
That seems completely consistent with realism. It's not something much of what you've said so far, I guess I don't want to deny. Do you want to say more to qualify realism, or should I say a little bit to offer a contrast?
Well, I guess just very briefly, the realist faces a very heavy burden because he has to try to explain in what this domain of objectivity or shared facts might consist, how we could have knowledge of it, how it's possible for us to communicate about it, how we discover, if we do at all, the moral truths. And so I think it's a view that bears a lot of explaining, but I think a fair amount of common sense actually answers to this conception. And so it's the job of the philosophical moral realist like myself to try to explain how that's possible. Okay.
Now, I take it that, I know there were a couple of other qualifications you wanted to mention.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I could just say something briefly about moral irrealism or anti-realism.
Sure.
I'm going to use those two words to mean the same thing. I'll try to say anti-realism just so that I can be heard, although I tend to favor the other locution.
Right.
I think there are no moral facts. I don't deny that people have moral opinions, moral beliefs. So you and I at one time spoke about distinguishing two different senses of the word morality, right? One sense is a descriptive sense. In that sense, we could say, well, you know, he's got a different morality than I do, or that culture has a different morality than our culture. But that's not the sense philosophers are interested in, neither one of us, I guess. The sense we're interested in is a more normative sense.
Well, I guess we're interested in the descriptive insofar as we want to understand human diversity and learn from it. But yeah, you're right. It's not the question that we're directly facing when we ask about realism versus anti-realism.
So when we talk about anti-realism, I'm not. I don't want to claim that. I think my morality in the descriptive sense, the code I choose to live by or something like that, is the correct one. I don't think that there's anything authoritative about my own judgments or anybody's judgments. That's why I'm not a relativist, or that's at least one reason why I'm not a relativist. Here's the way I'd contrast things. There are questions of fact, like the question of whether there's life on other planets, for example. We may not know the answer to that question, but there is an answer. And then there are questions that are not questions of fact, or questions in realms which are not realms of fact, like what's the best color, or which is better, chocolate or vanilla. Even people who tend towards a kind of gastronomic objectivism or realism wouldn't, I think, accept that there's a fact of the matter about which is better, chocolate or vanilla. There might be a fact about what people prefer. There might be a fact about what's less expensive. There might be a fact about what's more healthy or healthful. But there's no fact about which is better. And likewise, I want to claim that there are no facts about what's morally better, no correct answers to moral questions. That's not the same thing as saying that we don't know the answers. You and I agree that if there were answers, we might not know some of them. That's not my way of saying that I'm not going to be dogmatic about the answers, and you are. I don't think either one of us is. Some people have accused anti-realists of being dogmatic because we believe we can't be wrong, but I think it's important to remember that we think we can't be right either.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any matters to be right or wrong about with respect to the traditional terms in the moral vocabulary, like good, right, in the moral sense, virtuous, vicious, etc. It doesn't mean that I don't have values. I mean, just think about realms in which you make evaluative sort of judgments, but you don't think that any value judgments are really correct. One example for me is sports teams. I'm a Red Sox fan. I'll say things, I'll say boo Yankees, or I might even say the Yankees stink, but I certainly won't be making a claim about their baseball playing skills when I say that they stink. I'll be expressing my attitude, which is anti-Yankee. I don't think it's the correct attitude to have. My son has the opposite attitude. I don't think he's wrong. So if I disagree with him, it's a disagreement in attitude. But those are attitudes that I might feel very strongly, and in the case of attitudes that would traditionally be thought to be moral ones, I might take them very seriously indeed, because like anybody else, I recognize that we face questions of cooperation and coordination. We have collective problems to solve about resource allocation, etc., and I take those questions to be ones that human beings are extremely interested in answering, trying to answer in ways that are cooperative, that involve reason where possible. And so I take these moral values very seriously, even though I don't believe them to be reflective of some fact of the matter that we could hope to discover.
So I guess to take you back to your analogy with sports and flavor, I guess I would say that when you say you're pro-Yankees or you're a Yankee fan,
I say I don't think Peter, let's get this straight. It's kind of important. I'm a Red Sox fan.
Oh, you're a Red Sox fan. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Please don't make that mistake again.
It's typical of philosophers that we don't pay attention to such vital things. So yes,
some of the most important things, right, get left aside.
Right. So you're a Red Sox fan.
Thank you.
Now, presumably you don't think that the Yankee fans are making any kind of a mistake by rooting for the Yankees, even though you hate it when the Yankees win. When you look at some native New Yorker being loyal to his team, you think, well, that's as he should be. There should be fans for the Yankees, just as there should be fans for the Red Sox, and that you don't see yourself as disagreeing really with the fans' evaluation in that sense, because there's a sense in which you're not competing for the same question when you cheer your team and he cheers his own team, because what you're rooting for there is something that expresses a personal loyalty, and it's the nature of a sports competition that we think that it's reasonable that the teams be competitive and that the better team win. But now, take a different kind of sports analogy.
Can I just qualify what you said to make sure we're in agreement?
Sure.
I don't think that it's correct for the other person to be a Yankee fan in the sense that there's a right team for a New Yorker to support.
Right.
This gets to be a little inside baseball, but you may know that there are plenty of New Yorkers who hate the Yankees and love the Mets, for example.
Sure.
And I don't think that anybody's making any mistakes or doing the right thing. I think it's okay to, I'm not against, shall we say, picking a team utterly arbitrarily. So I might have been born in, Guam and still be a Red Sox fan, or
right.
I don't think that a mistake
and you
was
think
possible.
it's possible and fine that some people don't particularly care about baseball at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
but most of us do care about
sense,
how to live among one another.
Yeah, and take another sports case. Suppose there's been a call in an important game made by a ref, and this is the fourth time in that game that the ref has made a very controversial call in favor of one team rather than the other. And you look at the video replay and you think, he's not exercising his function as a ref. He's not judging fairly. Now, if he says, well, there's no fact about a fair judgment here. I think I'm right, and you can have your own opinion. That's fine. I just happen to be the one who decides this. You'd say, well, the fact that you're deciding it gives you special responsibilities, and you have to be reasonable and objective and fair. And it seems to me that in defending that principle also as a rule of sports, you think that's a good principle. That's how sports should be done. It shouldn't be done by payola or by bias. And so it seems to me those judgments are quite different from your feelings toward your very strong positive feelings toward the Red Sox and your antipathy to the Yankees. I think that's a different kind of feeling that you have. And therefore, when the ref makes this call, your response isn't that, darn, I'd hoped that we'd win. Your response is, well, that's wrong, and that man should be removed. He's not exercising his function properly. He's violating a very important principle.
So let's see if we can break that down a little bit, and I think it might help to get at some of our differences, because once again, I agree with a lot, and I don't agree with all of what you've said. First, there's a factual matter about whether, say, the foot touched the first base first, or the glove, or let's say the batter's foot or the runner's foot touched first base first, or the first baseman's foot touched first. Right? There's an objective question about what happened. Did the ball go over the field? Was it to the left or the right of the foul pole?
Right.
Those are matters of fact, and of course I can claim that somebody got the facts wrong without having made any evaluative judgments. That much we agree on. The question is whether I think that the ref ought to make the factually correct judgment, and that it's a fact that the ref ought to make the factually correct judgment. So it's a second layer of facts, I guess. We agree that there's a fact of the matter about whether the ball went over the fence or not. There's a further question what the ref ought to do about that. Right. And you're claiming that, as a sports fan, I probably am committed to the claim that there's a way the ref ought to behave.
Well, and that might not even... Well, I would say that your sense there isn't just contingent upon your being a sports fan. I might not be particularly a baseball fan, but I think you could explain to someone why you had this reaction to this ref's call and why you think it's important for the ref to be removed from the game or whatever, in a way that doesn't even presuppose that the person's interested in sports. It's a perfectly intelligible explanation given what function he's supposed to play.
Fair enough.
And so the reasons that you give are, I think, quite general reasons. And if we think of that kind of a dispute as the model of a moral dispute, it seems to me people want to be able to make their views, express their views in a voice that's not just their personal voice. That is, when you're criticizing the ref, you're trying to speak in an impersonal voice, not just on behalf of Don Loeb or on behalf of the Red Sox, but an impersonal voice, and so you impose upon yourself certain constraints. So if the video replay does, in fact, contradict the way you thought it went, you'll have to say, well, I was wrong about that. So you take that as a set of constraints, but I think you also take impartiality as a constraint in much the same way.
Now,
and that, I would say, is a typical moral norm.
Now, I don't want to disagree that there can be something which the philosopher John Mackey called objectivity relative to standards. Mm-hmm. So I think that the referee could be appointed to do a certain job which we find it useful to accomplish, namely being an impartial judge of whether the ball went over the fence or not. just to use our toy example.
Right.
And I think we could say the referee is not doing the job that he agreed to do. The referee is not doing the job that we hired him to do. No one will enjoy the game as much if referees don't do that. That's grounds for choosing to hire and fire. That all seems okay to me. The question is, none of that seems to me to suggest that the standards themselves are objective. It didn't have to be the case that the rule was if it's over the fence, it's a home run. It's not a home run. That was a matter of decision. And sure, there's an objective question about what meets that standard, but the standard itself is not one that was chosen because it's objectively correct or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
that would be a more realist perspective on that, I guess.
Right. And of course, many of the rules of a sport are arbitrary. On the other hand, I think some of the things that you consider, you just mentioned, such as keeping to one's contractual obligations, keeping one's word, and so on, those I don't think we think of as varying depending upon the local rules for what counts as a score, or the laws of any particular state, or the customs of any particular set of people. We think keeping one's word is a perfectly general kind of principle, and we can understand how there are enduring interests that underwrite the principle. These are situations that will recur throughout human existence. It's a form of failure to not only respect other people, but to take their concerns seriously. If you think that you can give them expectations and then arbitrarily break them on your own account. And so I think an institution like keeping one's word, which seems to be perfectly generic, it's something we find everywhere, and we find people everywhere honored or criticized, depending upon whether they're people who keep their word, that's a principle that, again, does not depend upon anyone having set up any rules in advance of baseball or traffic laws or even a constitution of a country. That's something, counting on someone else and giving someone an expectation and meeting their expectation, that seems to me something that we can understand non-conventionally, even though, of course, there are conventions about contracts and so on when we finally spell the thing out. The underlying principle seems to be one of faithfulness and fidelity and taking the other person's interests into account that generalizes quite indifferently with regard to local customs.
Well, first, I do want to agree. I hope I can end with a question for you, but I do want to agree that
Sure.
There could be intersubjectively agreed upon norms. That is, there might be norms that suggest themselves to any group of people, for example, that want to get along with one another in a way that involves communication. If you can't by and large, assume that what's coming out of people's mouths is the truth, especially when they say things like, I promise, or in my role as referee, I, hereby proclaim, then you're not going to be able to enjoy things like baseball very much. And I think that's a fact about the world and one I can acknowledge. So I don't want to disagree that there are, take chocolate versus vanilla. It may be that right now, I guess, when I do surveys in class, I'm never really sure how accurate these are, but I get most of my students preferring chocolate pretty strongly to vanilla. But I don't get anybody thinking seriously that the other side is wrong to do so. Now, suppose everybody liked chocolate better than vanilla. Suppose you could make a perfectly healthy, healthful food that tasted an awful lot like sand. I don't think anybody would like it. And I don't think anybody would make any money selling it. And I don't think anybody would buy it or consume it unless they had to. But I don't think it's the wrong flavor. I just think it's flavor that's not one that people like.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so one question that I face as a moral realist is someone will say, well, what are these moral facts you're talking about? Are they things like people's need, do they just supervene on, depend upon people's needs and interests? Do they have some kind of metaphysical status of being abstract truths, the way that we think some people at any rate think. There are abstract truths of arithmetic and geometry, which can be known by a kind of rational a priori insight. And of course, moral realists vary quite a bit in how they answer that question. Some do think of morality something like an analogy with mathematics, in that it's a kind of rational intuition. I don't myself find that view entirely understandable. It seems to me that when I'm understanding moral judgments, moral principles, where they come from, I'm looking at the facts on the ground about enduring human needs and interests, what constitutes or doesn't constitute flourishing, what would be an impartial arrangement that counted the interests of all fairly, and so on. And so I'm what's called a naturalistic moral realist, because I think moral judgments come to ground in essentially natural facts of that kind. So it might very well be the case.
Peter?
Sorry?
More than that, you think the moral facts themselves are natural facts. They're not, because the person who took it on the analogy of mathematics, say, might think that moral facts are grounded in natural facts. So it's wrong to break a promise is a non-natural fact, but it's what you did was wrong is true in a certain circumstance because of the natural fact that you broke a promise.
Right. And this is really a delicate question, because I don't think moral concepts are natural concepts, whereas I do think moral facts are natural facts. So how would I make this kind of a distinction? Think of a concept as a way in which we reach something to think about it. So concept just means that with which we take. And so moral concepts are a distinctive way of thinking about essentially natural facts. And they have their own requirements. I think among the requirements of moral concepts are many things I've mentioned already. They need to be impartial. They need to concern human well-being, need to concern some form of well-being. It could be animal, for example. They need to embody some notions of reciprocity. They have to be such that they can be responsive to features of the human motivational system. So there are constraints regarding what sorts of things we can be obliged to do based upon what sorts of motives people could potentially have. And so I think there's sort of a concept there for the moral that leads us to think about the natural world in this evaluative frame. And in that frame, it is essentially connected with phenomena like evaluation, recommendation, judgments of obligation, and so on. At the same time, I think that this doesn't require some special class of moral properties in order for those judgments to be true. It suffices that there be natural properties which answer to the needs that are laid down by this concept, or these concepts. And so in that sense, I would accept your characterization of the view as not having moral facts be non-natural. They, in fact, participate, I think, in the natural world, and that's how we are able to know about them and refer to them in our language. But at the same time, I think the concepts that we use in the moral case are distinctive, and part of the way in which morality gets its role in our lives, or why we have a moral language, is that there's a function for concepts that have exactly those features.
Okay, so the various constraints on moral reasoning and thought that you have adverted to here, including things like impartiality, maybe consistency, responsiveness to the non-moral facts, taking people's interests serious as non-morally characterized somehow seriously. Where do those come from? You think they come from, that is, there are certain kinds of questions that we want to ask, and there are concepts reflected in those, which those questions reflect?
Yeah, that's right. Think of it, you might think of this as sort of in two steps. You might think, suppose people didn't have moral concepts. They could ask questions about, what would we decide to do if we were to take everyone's interests into consideration? What would we decide to do if we took into account reciprocal relations of respect among people? How would we think about this if we required ourselves to be consistent from case to case so that we treated like cases alike? they could ask all those questions, and then they'd say, we often are involved in this kind of discussion, and there ought to be a term that we use specifically to talk about this constellation of features so that it'll be possible for us to have these discussions. And so they would invent themselves moral concepts. They would be the ones that answered to those roles. And so I don't think that the mere existence of moral concepts makes morality important. Rather, it's the sort of thing that makes morality important that make moral concepts so vital to us.
That's really helpful, and maybe I could use that to segue in a bit into a little bit of further detail about kinds of moral irrealism and what they accept and deny in that picture.
Yes. What does one deny?
Well, first, a traditional distinction that not all our viewers may be familiar with is between cognitivist and non-cognitivist approaches to moral language and thought, sometimes called descriptivist and non-descriptivist approaches. And there's much heated and, to my mind, unnecessary debate over which term to use. On a cognitivist approach, when people in general make moral claims or talk moral talk, think moral thoughts, they're, in the speaking case, making factual assertions, more technically expressing propositions, the sorts of things that could be true or false.
So to do that anyhow, yeah.
To make a moral claim is to make a statement, just like to make a statement that the cat is on the mat is to make a statement. It could be true, it could be false. It could have a false presupposition even, but at least it's a factual assertion. As opposed to shut the door, which is not a factual assertion, or yay, Red Sox, which is not a factual assertion. It'd be very odd if someone said, yes, you're right, yay, Red Sox, or yes, you're right, shut the door.
Yeah.
Because I didn't make a factual assertion when I said either one of those things. Another approach says that the expressive or attitude displaying function is primary, and that when people make moral assertions, for example, they're, on an early version of this view, merely expressing their attitudes or emotions, and not, as it were, even trying to make factual claims, and thus not saying something that could be true or false. That would be a non-cognitivist approach to moral semantics. And if I've characterized those enough for people to grasp what I'm getting at, then you can see that there are two sorts of irrealism that can emerge. One is a non-cognitivist irrealism, according to which we were never talking about a realm of fact in the first place. Mm-hmm. And the other is a cognitivist version, which says, we're talking about a realm we take to be a realm of fact, but there are no such facts. Analogizing to, say, unicorn talk among unicorn believers, or, the way an atheist would look at talk about God. When people talk about God, they're not merely displaying their emotions, they're making factual assertions. The atheist just believes that they're wrong about that.
Right, and we could even make a distinction here between two kinds of views of God. Might be a useful illustration of this distinction. One view about God is that God is some kind of a person, all-powerful person governing the universe. And when the atheist denies the existence of God, he's claiming there is no such person.
Yep.
And when the theist says that God exists, he's claiming that there is. And that seems like a straightforwardly factual dispute. On the other hand, there are theologians who say, no, to believe in the existence of God is not to think that there's some being or some entity. It's to have a certain attitude toward the world. It's to be an optimist about possibility. It's to advocate and practice certain rules. And so belief in God is really constituted by a set of attitudes and practices. And in that sense, to be an atheist would be to object to those attitudes or practices, perhaps, but it would not be a factual disagreement between them. And so the person who's advocating the second view about God is, in some sense, he's theological enough. He may be extremely earnest, but he's making the claim that theological language is not best understood as factual. And a lot of people say the same thing about moral language, that it's not best understood as factual. And so to be an irrealist in that sense isn't necessarily to want people to change the way they speak morally, but just to recognize that when they're speaking morally, they're advocating and expressing attitudes. They're not making factual claims one way or another.
Yep. Now, the moral version of this is much more familiar, at least to me, than the theological version. I'm inclined to say that the theologian who makes such claims, well, you've changed the subject. God talk was always talk about a being, and it may be that you want to take over that talk for a different purpose, and gosh, because it doesn't make the mistake of believing in an entity that doesn't exist, I admire the purpose more, but I'd ask the person to, I guess, admit that that we've really changed the subject, and I would think that that's not standard God talk. It's an open question whether that's true in the moral case or not,
Right. Yeah.
in the case of moral language or not. But in the God case, I'd find that kind of an unusual move on the part of someone claiming to be a theologian.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's quite true in the religious case, and it does seem fairly obvious that if nothing else, maybe such a view is a reasonable one to have, but it doesn't seem to be a very accurate view about what most people mean by God or have meant historically by God. And so an advocate of that view, as you say, is going to look like he's advocating some kind of a reform of our language, some change in the way that we speak about God. By contrast, the non-cognitivist in the moral case is trying to give an analysis of the way that we ordinarily use the moral language and claiming that in our ordinary use, we are essentially expressing attitudes, taking stances, and not making claims of a descriptive or factual nature. And of course, what's the challenge for any such position is to say why it is that moral language has the features that it does have if it's not about a subject matter with regard to which we can have truth or falsehood, because people commonly say of some particular moral claim that's false. They talk about inconsistency in moral claims. They talk about logical implications of moral claims. And so non-cognitivists in that sense have the burden of trying to explain how all these features of language could exist, even if all along it's just been expressive. And in the recent decades, a great deal of progress has been made by non-cognitivists
stepping up to the plate.
Moral philosophy, showing how this is possible. So there's been a whole suite of developments, and the debate is now much clearer. But what's interesting, in a way, is that the people advocating these views, which are now called expressivist more generically, often want to be able to talk about truth as well. And so they want that feature of moral language to remain unperturbed. And so they will say, in effect, there's a use of truth for which it suffices just that the language have enough of this logical structure to make that use of truth appropriate. And so it's a sort of non-metaphysical or minimalist notion of truth. But someone with such a view is not going to try to contradict me, at any rate, by saying that we can't speak of moral judgments as true or false. And indeed, he would be trying to explain just how we can do that. Whereas the error theorist all along thinks that the judgments can be true or false. He simply thinks that they're systematically false.
Let me, if it's okay, let me make two comments about that. One is that I actually think that the folks you were talking about, we can use the word expressivist perhaps for the modern variety that wants to reincorporate notions of truth, if only minimalist truth, and so on, into their interpretation of morality is essentially, moral talk is essentially expressive, and something like traditional non-cognitivist for the variety that we began with, where making a moral statement is something like saying yay, or commanding somebody to do something. I guess I think that these expressivists of recent vintage have a lot more in common with you realists than they do with somebody like me, because you both want to talk in terms of moral facts and make statements like that, and I don't. So that's the first point. It seemed to me like those developments reflected a kind of a convergence among realists and expressivists on what it is moral discourse might be trying to get at putting aside certain very fine-grained metaphysical disputes, where the position that's emerged is one that, in my mind, looks a lot like, in many ways, looks a lot like the realist position, and very much unlike my view.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly,
I think if I could just interject, sure. It remains the case that a very fundamentally different explanation is being given of the surface features of moral discourse, and it's part of the expressivist position now that, of course, moral discourse is just one form of normative discourse. We also have normative discourse about what's right to believe or appropriate to believe, what's best warranted, discourse about what's rational or irrational to do, prudent or imprudent, aesthetic discourse. And what they want to do is to give a perfectly general account of how that kind of discourse differs from prosaically factual discourse in terms of this special relation to the expression of motivational states and attitudes that have a non-cognitive dimension. So I would say, yes, the views seem to converge in many respects, but there's a fundamental difference in the structure of explanation.
And
sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but that's very helpful, actually. So the difference is in the explanation for the use of this kind of vocabulary and this way of thinking.
Right.
And it's grounded in a desire to connect that, or a feeling that it's important somehow to connect that to motivation, what philosophers call practicality, reason-giving, that sort of thing.
Right.
And that involves the expressivist playing to a traditional non-cognitivist strong suit, or what's often thought to be a strong suit, namely, there's another element of ordinary moral discourse. We focused a lot on the objective-seeming features of ordinary moral thought and discourse. But there's another element, which is the practical element. That is, we think of it as something we can use to guide our lives, as sometimes we might think of it as a knowing how to live rather than knowing what is the case. Mm-hmm. And non-cognitivists have always claimed a bit of an edge on that dimension, because there's a kind of automatic connection between the norms that I'll express or the attitudes that I will express and my own motivations. So that comes as a kind of freebie for this sort of expressivist. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's been a central part of why these views have been attractive. On the other hand, people, and I belong to this group, think that motivation itself is not a really adequate answer to the question about normativity, and that we can't really understand even our own sense of why norms or obligations or values are at stake in terms of somehow or other features that basically trace back to one way or another to the speaker's motivational states. It seems to me that when I make a judgment about what it's rational for someone to do or what it's moral or immoral to do, there's a way in which I'm essentially trying to anchor my judgment elsewhere. And in that sense, there will be a relation to my motives, because we're mostly motivated to do what we think is rational, reasonable, and good. But I don't think my motives can play this pivotal role in determining what it is that I'm even trying to do or meaning to do when I make moral judgments. So that's a residual disagreement. But I gather that you've got an objection to both the non-cognitivist and the cognitivist, both the realist, as we've been describing them, and the non-cognitivist, in that you think that they share an erroneous assumption about moral language itself.
That's right. I'm tempted, at least very strongly, by a third sort of irrealist view, one according to which neither cognitivism nor non-cognitivism is correct, and one which explains the persistence of these two philosophical approaches to moral semantics as stemming in part from they're both getting something right about what we're trying to do when we talk moral talk or think moral thoughts. Mm-hmm. the worry I have is that no account of the terms in the moral vocabulary, or as you said, the concepts that stand behind them, will get enough right to capture, will both get enough right to capture what people are trying to do generally when they speak moral talk, when they talk moral talk and think moral thoughts, and remain coherent. So that sometimes I think we're trying to merely express attitudes, or and sometimes I think we're trying to make factual assertions, and sometimes I think there are some people who are whose moral talk is more generally intended as factive, and some whose moral talk is generally not intended as factive. But I suspect that there's quite a bit of cacophony here, and I think that diagnosis applies to many of the issues that have divided people on the two sides or the many sides of these debates about moral realism. So, for example, I think that there are people who are, I want to grant that there are trivial or peripheral uses of any vocabulary, and those aren't what I'm worried about.
Right.
So there might be people who, never refer to something as a table unless it has four legs. And those people would be using the word table in a very different way than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And I don't think an analysis of the word table needs to accommodate every single idiosyncrasy. But I do think there's such a thing as changing the subject. So if somebody said of tables that it was essential to their nature that they were immaterial, for example, or that nothing could ever rest on them, then I think that would be very strong evidence that the person is talking about something very different than what I'm talking about. And my worry is that there's nothing that we're all talking about in common when we use the words in the moral vocabulary. Some people perhaps are talking about what they take to be the will of God. Now, some of those people would give up the claim that morality is the will of God if they were to be convinced that there was no God. But others, I think, wouldn't. They'd just say, well, then I guess there's no morality. There may be something else, but whatever it isn't morality, because morality is of necessity the will of God, and if there is no will of God, there's no morality. Likewise with motivational power upon recognition, and many other dimensions of moral thought and language that seem to divide us. The worry is that you can't put together... Sorry?
I'm sorry. Your thought is that given this diversity of usage and the fact that you don't think there is a common intention governing all these different uses, that people like me or like standard non-cognitivists are trying to run a coherent interpretation of a discourse that you think lacks enough coherence to support it. Is that
That's right. As if somebody were to try to say, look, here's my analysis of the phrase round square. Now, it's not an analysis of something that's quite round, really, or quite square, because that would be incoherent, but I'm still giving you the essence of round square, and not just sort of stepping back and saying, well, there's no such thing as a round square. There couldn't be, because it would have to be both round and square at the same time, and nothing could be. There might be roundish, squarish things, but those aren't round squares.
Yeah.
Likewise with morality, there may be no such thing as moral rightness, although there may be lots of properties or realms of fact that I wouldn't want to, the existence of which I wouldn't want to deny, but I just wouldn't want to honor, attach the honorific moral rightness to. So, for example, there may be a fact about what some conception of utility would be the utility maximizing course of action for a given individual in a given circumstance. There might be a fact about that, but I don't think it's a fact about what's morally right.
So, if I were to respond, let's say, on behalf of the kind of view that I'm pushing, or maybe on behalf even of the non-cognitivist or expressivist interpretation, I guess I would say our aspiration, at any rate, is to capture some core of usage, which we think is an important phenomenon in human life. It's one that almost everyone touches upon at some point in their discourse, in their concerns toward one another. And that while it may be the case, as you say, that people differ a great deal about what sorts of things they think count as moral-making features, whether they have to be the will of a supreme being or whether they have to be, in some sense, rationally mandatory or something like that. They disagree about that. It seems to me there's a common enterprise there of trying to determine how to respond to certain questions about how to live together, what conventions we should observe, insofar as these are up to us to decide, and that those questions remain the same, and they require us to be able to think together along lines that are characteristic of moral thought, impartially, consistently, and so on. And so there's a problem there that we all face. There's a core of language which is invoked in dealing with that problem, and that's what we're trying essentially to analyze and to give an account of. I guess you would say that we're still misleading ourselves about how much, even in that core of usages and those central deliberative questions, how much commonality there actually is.
That's right. And the degree to which what's common rests on intersubjective choice or attitude, even built in by evolution, as opposed to discovering facts. So, I agree that we have to figure out how to live together, and we have to figure out how to cooperate. There are benefits to us of cooperating that I don't want to set aside, that we need language for that, but I don't think that that's going to solve the problem. When we start to get down to the particulars, like what's the nature of your commitment to consistency or universalizability or objectivity or impartiality, I think we'll find vast differences. And I suspect, anyway, that those differences are substantial enough, even after careful scrutiny, that it would not be appropriate to say that there's a common subject matter, except in the most abstract terms, a common set of questions we're all trying to answer, and thus that there's such a thing as moral rightness or moral goodness, etc. There might be moral rightness, as I like to say, sub-16, where that means, of the many, many different uses of the term or ways in which we could look at understand the term, there might be, facts about what one of them requires, and that might be one that's, especially interesting to certain philosophers, but I don't think one way of doing it among many others, none of which has any particular claim to being, to the honorific moral rightness, say, is going to be satisfying for a moral realist like you. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and, even if I were to grant that there is this large diversity in usage, I guess, at least the sort of moral realist I am, I would say, historically even, we can see that there's been evolution in moral language. So perhaps at a certain time, historically, moral language was fairly essentially tied to religious considerations. I think we have, in the last several centuries, we've been able to distinguish a notion of morality that isn't essentially tied to divine will or divine punishment. And I think that that's an important gain in conceptual clarity, and important also for the possibility of people with religious conflicts coming together on moral questions. And so I think of things like the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and I think people from very different cultural and religious backgrounds can agree on those fundamental rights, because they do represent something that is a common set of understandings, and in that sense, we need a language to account for what it is that's being claimed when a fundamental right is being claimed. And so I would myself be willing to say, sure, there probably is some measure of reform introduced by anyone who tries to give a coherent, systematic analysis of moral language. That needn't be a terrible thing if what is happening is that an enterprise or a project or a common set of concerns, which are being advanced on many fronts, can also be advanced by the development of language. And so just as I think we've made progress in recognizing the equality of women, human equality, respecting that children have rights and claims, noticing that people who have disabilities and handicaps deserve treatment that enables them to live, insofar as possible, a life comparable to the rest, that we've made progress in recognizing those substantive principles. I think we've probably also made progress in understanding what it is that is the touchstone for the reasoning behind those. And so in that sense, there probably is some evolution in moral language happening even now as we speak. And I would be someone who is pushing that process maybe a bit further along in the direction of saying, yes, if we recognize moral language as having the kind of grounding that you and I have been discussing in terms of human needs and reoccurring situations, the importance of cooperation and so on, as we recognize that, we will become more and more confident that there is a basis for making moral judgment, and it's a constraint on how we should think about our lives that we can accord respect to, understanding that of course, this may not be exactly what people meant 200 years ago by morality.
It may not be what a lot of people mean right now by it, if I'm understanding it.
Yeah, and so in that sense, you could say there really ought to be distinguished two projects. One is the project of giving the best descriptive analysis of moral language, and that could turn out to be a project which requires quite a diverse theory in order to accommodate the range of usage. And then there's what you might think of as a normative project, which is asking something like, given the core role of these kinds of concepts in guiding our decisions and our activities, how best might we use them?
When you say how best might we use them, I assume you're using the word best in a way that doesn't presuppose an answer to the question you're asking.
That's right. And so it has to be best in some sense that isn't simply moral. That would obviously be circular and uninformative. So, for example, we might say, well, it's important if, for example, we are able to take factual considerations into account, and therefore we seek the best factual information in making moral judgments. It's important that we not make arbitrary distinctions between persons, and so therefore we need to understand the ways in which people are similar, no matter what their race or gender or where it is they happen to live in the world. And so when I think of these criteria of choice, I don't think of them as essentially moral. I think of them as criteria that we can use to generate reasons of a quite general kind. It's very similar to the kinds of reasons that we use when we're asking about how to justify our claims to knowledge or our claims about what would be of aesthetic value. So it's very general criteria that are in play here.
I suspect you'll find, my guess is that there's a good deal more controversy with respect to aesthetic value than moral, and less with respect to epistemic value. But I'm not sure about that. I guess I'm wondering why you think of this as moral realism anymore instead of realism about something new, an interesting concept, not the moral concept, maybe a relative or a descendant of it. Mm-hmm. But why do you think of this as moral realism?
Well, I think it's grasping the essential core that's been in common from, so far as I can tell, maybe the writings of the ancient Greeks to the current time. And so in that sense, there are what you might think of as continued intentions or a commonality in purpose. Namely, we're looking for the most general, most universally defensible, most capable of being represented as unbiased, as operating on basis of reasons that anyone could recognize. The project of looking for something that answers to those criteria, that's been continuous for as long as we've had philosophy. And so I guess I would say I think of this as part of that project, and it's, in that sense, quite entitled to the term moral. It is very, when we read Aristotle, or we read Kant, or we read Mill, we can identify this common project, and insofar as we understand it, we can find it in everyday life and in ways in which people defend or attack, justify, or try to revise opinions. And so, just as the epistemic enterprise seems to me to be largely continuous, I think the moral enterprise is as well, even though throughout history people have, of course, made what we hope is some kind of progress, both at the conceptual and at the level of actual application in all these areas.
I guess my worry is, Peter, that that if we focus on the elements that appear to be common, we may end up rejecting elements that were essential to the concepts in their various manifestations, and that what we found is what we can agree on. I mean, suppose it turns out there are elements that are just inherently controversial, just the way we're put together. Right. And so we say, well, let's leave that out of our concept of morality. That, on some views, would leave morality very impoverished. Imagine you're talking to a voluntarist, someone who thinks that morality is rooted in the will of God. You say to the person, well, you're wrong about what this common enterprise that goes all the way back to Aristotle is, or do you say you're engaged in a different enterprise than I am, or what?
Or what, yeah. So the common enterprise is the most general questions we can ask about how we should act, what we should do, how we should treat one another, how we should live together, what sorts of lives are good lives to lead. And it seems to me that even the theological voluntarist is clearly trying to answer those questions. And so, right. Yes, it may be that he or she thinks that the touchstone for answering them is something in a sacred scripture. But the questions that are at issue seem to me to be the same ones, and that individual's sense that they are providing the most general and best warranted rationale for one way or another of answering those questions, that seems to be essentially the same. So I would point not so much to the specific criteria that are being used, but to the kinds of questions that are being asked, what purpose they're playing in the regulation of human activity, and how it is that the person thinks justifications have to be put together. And I think if someone insists, for example, that, suppose I meet someone and we're having what sounds like a moral conversation, and the individual says, well, look, you see, Peter, I think that my opinion is, by definition, morally correct. And therefore, I myself am in a position to decide all moral questions. Well, I'll say, well, that's clearly someone who's using the term in a non-standard way, and I'm not trying to capture that person's analysis. Similarly, if someone thought the same thing about, well, my tribe or my people, I'd say, well, I think that is actually a different concept that you're using, because you're not even purporting to be answerable to interest in a universal or general way. But insofar as they're purporting to be answerable to those concerns, then I think, yeah, we're having a moral disagreement rather than talking about two different subjects.
So, forgive me, but that seems like the easy case to me. I want to try to figure out how to get along with other people. I want to try to find codes to live by. I might even want to sign off on them, pass constitutions and that sort of thing.
Right.
No different from you or the person you're imagining talking to. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you characterize the project, you talk about the general goals of getting along with one another, cooperating, etc. And sometimes you also talk about what I would take to be certain methodological constraints on how the discussion goes along. Some of those appear to me less controversial than others. You'll find a lot of agreement on consistency, for example, for reasons I think can be made pretty obvious.
Right.
But what if this person says, no, it's nothing to do with my thinking I'm right or I'm an authority. That would just be provincial. I'm not like that at all, because Don, certainly don't think I'm an authority on morality. I don't think there are right answers, much less the answers I give are the right ones.
Right.
But what if somebody says, look, I want to answer these questions in different ways. You push this universalizability thing to the point where it looks like, imagine a form of utilitarianism emerges, but that's inconsistent with deeply held commitments that I hold, that I take to be more important. So methodology be damned if it, or at least those elements that lead us there, if we run up against very strong commitments that I find myself holding and take to be central.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I want to know is, in thinking that there's this project we've all been engaged in, I want to say, yeah, we've all been trying to figure out since Plato how to live among one another, but there have been very big differences about how to do that. Some people, some philosophers famously have thought the best way to do it is to look for the way that, maximizes utility, characterized in a certain way. And others have thought, no, it's the way that treats people as ends in themselves and never merely as means. And consequences are less important on that conception. Isn't it just optimistic to think that that built into that common project of trying to get along is a way to resolve questions like that? And, to my mind, many other questions.
Yeah. Well, if we look at actual moral disputes, I think you and I would probably agree that there are different levels at which moral disputes occur. So, take, say, the example of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. I think most moral philosophers, no matter what their stripe, would agree with most of those principles. They'll try to give different explanations of why the principles are true or how we might best justify them. But at that level, the kind of disagreement that we're getting is not one of irreconcilable differences. People can't understand why on earth anybody would be claiming something like that individuals ought to have some say in the kind of governance that they live under. I think this is widely understood, and so in that sense, I guess I would say when the Kantian and the utilitarian give their competing explanations of where rights come from, I think they understand each other quite well, and they think they are talking about a common set of concerns, and they're competing to give the best explanation, but a lot of the constraints on what counts as a good explanation will be the same for both. And that, among other things, explains why it is that they tend to give so many judgments in so many areas that are quite similar. And I certainly don't think the criteria of moral concepts are sufficient to decide these questions. So there'll be substantive issues of value that we'll have to settle in other ways. But the premise of realism, just as the premise of realism about the external world, is not that we have a way of forcing mandatory rational agreement on the way the world is. It's rather that the world exists and has certain properties independent of the way that we happen to think about it, and that those can, if we inquire in just the right way, exert a kind of constraint on what we believe, that we can be wrong about what we think. There's a distinction between appearance and reality. And insofar as possible, we want our inquiry to be constrained by features of the real and to help us get beyond mere appearances. So realism about the external world isn't in peril from the fact that scientific theories and common sense theories about the world have evolved quite a bit historically, and they're still controversial in many ways. Because what the realist is maintaining there is something about the general process underlying and the general ambitions or aspirations of the claims that are being made. And the same is true in the moral case. So would be very surprised indeed if it were easier to answer moral questions than it is to answer questions about the natural world. We're talking about incredibly complex human and, well, now more than human systems. And just as it's very hard to know what the sources of unemployment or inflation might be, it's very hard to know what a fair division of social goods would constitute.
Well, I don't want to disagree with that. I want to disagree about whether, I guess I want to argue that whether there's such a thing as a fair distribution will depend on whether there's such a thing as what we've been talking about when we've used the word fair.
Yeah.
And that when I look at things, I think, gosh, it seems awfully optimistic to think that there's an answer waiting to be discovered. I guess I think the differences on methodology between the Kantian, say, and the utilitarian are differences that count against there being a fact of the matter there, even if they agree that it's wrong to bomb the village. If they disagree about why it's wrong to bomb the village, that can be a pretty substantial disagreement. And I guess I think once we get out of our own culture and look around the world, or even within our culture in various ways, we find an awful lot of disagreement of a sort that, to my mind, it's at least optimistic to think will just resolve itself given our goal of finding a way to live together under terms, maybe even under terms we can agree to. I do think that there are people in the debate who don't care about securing agreement from, say, many others who might wish to be taken into consideration. I think there are competing views about what counts as interests, but also about the degree to which others' interests are to be taken into consideration. And so it looks to me like, well, yeah, I agree that we should try to find that we will want to try to find a way to get together, cooperate, etc. I agree that you and I will probably have some of the same norms of dispute resolution in mind. When we do that, to my mind, that reflects a value choice on my part, or values I just find myself with and am comfortable with, but not my having discovered some truth that I could be getting wrong about how to answer those questions.
So I guess if I look back on my own life, I think I can find some moments of moral discovery. I'm old enough to remember the first political meeting at which women stood up and said, this organization, for all that it's promoting progressive social causes, has systematically denied women important positions and systematically undervalued women's issues. And I thought about it, and my first reaction was probably like the first reaction of a lot of people, say, well, there are all these important problems in the world. There's hunger and war and so on. Why are these people making this issue? And I listened to them more, and I thought about it more, and I said, they're perfectly right. We have been systematically discriminating, and I don't really think of that as just a change in my values, the way that as I got older, I got less interested in death-defying sports and more interested in...
Except for bicycle riding.
Well, yes. And more interested in activities that involved finesse or something like that. It's not just a change in value, it was a genuine discovery, and I think they taught me that. And I think the best explanation of what's going on there is, just as in the aesthetic case, the emergence of something like jazz. The best explanation of what's going on there is that there are realms of value that we may fail to recognize, but which can be identified, and in suitable cases we can come to recognize them, and we will have learned something in the process and not simply changed in a way that would make no room for the idea that one set of views is any nearer getting things right than the other, because I think it is nearer getting things right, that we should not be discriminating against women, or that we should think of jazz as mere noise. That's an error, I think. So I guess I would say my own experience is hard for me to understand, if I think of it simply as a change in my commitments and values, because I think I've changed in response to considerations which have the force of reasons, and that's quite independent of whether I recognize them or not. Happily, in some cases I have. In many cases, there is much more for me to recognize.
And I, of course, want to agree with part of that, and not all of it. That is, I've had moments like the one you described. I'm not old enough to remember the particular sorts of discussions you're mentioning, but certainly there are analogs in my experience. And it did feel like progress to me. And there's a way in which sometimes I think it was progress and sometimes I think it wasn't. So, for example, when my moral views changed in response to what became clear to me was a more accurate understanding of the non-moral world, I thought that was an advance because I want my values to be responsive to that. So there was a time when I was not as aware of the extent of poverty in the world, or the extent to which it was relatively easy for someone here to do something small, at least, about it. And when I learned that, my moral views changed about what, or my commitments changed about what to do, or how much charity to give, for example, how much to take that into consideration when voting, for example. Do I think that it represented progress? In the sense that my views were now aligned better with the subjective reaction I'd have when confronted with non-moral facts I wasn't aware of before, sure. But take the example you gave about the revolutionary but sexist political group. We do find people in the world who have a very different attitude towards the status of women. I don't like the way they treat women. I'm really strongly against it. But is there something I can say to those people to explain why they're making a mistake when it's such a fundamental part of so many cultures?
Yes.
Or there maybe doesn't need to be. Because a lot of those people feel like, well, take somebody, for example, who, came to school here for a little while and said, for a while I was taken in with that equality of the sexes stuff.
Right.
But then I realized that that was really just not the proper respect to show to women, to treat them as if they're equals of men. That would be to completely deny the important role that they ought to play. I don't like that guy's values any more than you do. But what can I say to him to show him he's wrong, or what convinces you that he's wrong, as opposed to just, nauseating or to you, or acting in a way you find unappealing and hope others will, and would like to talk others into finding unappealing, etc.
Well, we would want to take his reasoning step by step. So take, for example, the claim that there's some specific function which is appropriate for women. We'd want to ask, well, how does one establish a claim that there's a specific function of women? Is there a specific function of men? And is the fact that, for example, men live a wide variety of different kinds of lives in terms of how much they are in public or not in public, and how much they are involved in the raising of children and not raising of children, is that incompatible with the nature of men? In what sense? How would it be possible to show that women had such a nature? And until one could show that, it seems to be the proper attitude to have is skepticism about the idea that there is a specific function to a gender. And so I guess we'd look at that part of his argument. We'd say, well, suppose we ask the question, what sorts of lives people find intrinsically rewarding or worthwhile? Are there women who find other kinds of lives intrinsically rewarding and worthwhile? And again, if we find that the answer to that question is yes, then it's an argument against the idea that requiring such people to live a very different kind of life would be good for them in any sense. And if we're not paying attention to what's good for them, then an important part of that individual's justificatory scheme has been withdrawn, because presumably he thinks, or wants to tell us anyhow, that he's concerned about what's good for people, and particularly good for women. And so we would challenge his claims step by step in that way. I don't know if we could convince the person to change his mind, But I think we could probably discover that it's not mere difference of opinion that's at stake between us, and in the process we might be led to revise our own views in certain ways. We probably don't take seriously enough, for example, forms of social solidarity that are characteristics of some societies but not ours. And it may be that we have systematically undervalued those and their importance in building good lives.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to doubt any of that. I do think that your discussion will probably bottom out at some point. I wouldn't want to make the test succeeding in convincing somebody, because then you're held hostage to stubbornness, or at least potentially held hostage to stubbornness.
Right.
But my question is whether I could convince somebody, whether I would have the tools that would convince somebody who was being rational. And my guess is that, and certainly in the discussions I've had with people like this, one bottoms out at some point on questions about which we can't say much more. Suppose the person said, I know some women find it less satisfying than they would other ways, but those are inherently base ways for people to find satisfaction in life. After all, there are people who find satisfaction in all sorts of base pursuits, or at least claim to. And that judgment, which I wouldn't find myself sympathetic with at all, would be very hard to distinguish in the abstract from an attitude like yours and my attitude that, people's interests matter in the first place, which I also don't think we can justify beyond a certain kind of commitment to acting as though that's true, right? I doubt that anything about, the way the world is forces that conclusion on us. We can see coherent lifestyles according to which it's not taken seriously. I don't like those. I'm not sympathetic, and I'm on the same team as you when it comes to that stuff, I think, pretty much. But my confidence that there's not some kind of optimistic assumption that it's not, that this is a matter for discovery, not for attitude or commitment, is misplaced. That's my guess, anyway. I could be wrong. Part of me sort of hopes I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say the part of you that hopes you're wrong is probably the part of you which wants to say something like, look, there's something very important at stake here, and I'm not comfortable thinking that it rests entirely upon matters of subjective preference. And in that sense, there's part of you that wants it. There's a sort of aspiration to the thought that there are criteria of moral assessment that are non-derivative from particular individual schemes of values or interests. And insofar as I'm trying to give an account of our moral self-understanding, it's that I'm trying to give an account of.
Yep.
And you might be right that that's a more fragile enterprise than philosophers often take it to be. It may be not as comprehensive in its scope of application as, say, a good descriptive analysis of moral language should be. But it's that aspiration of yours that I'm trying to win a place for. And I see also that we've now been hammering away at this very pleasantly for about an hour and 20 minutes. We should probably wrap up this conversation, but I hope there'll be others, and I've found it very useful having this discussion.
Me too, absolutely. And I hope informative for viewers as well. It does seem as though there's a lot we agree on and a lot we don't agree on. Mm-hmm. It's nice to be able to do it in such an atmosphere in which it's pretty clear both of us are trying to figure out the truth about this whole set of issues, and not just defend our particular prejudices as if we're defense attorneys for our own chosen viewpoints. That's pretty refreshing.
Yeah.
It's not uncharacteristic of my conversations with you, but it's still pretty refreshing. So I thank you for that.
Well, I thank you as well, and it's, to me, a great source of pride and pleasure to see how you've grown to become an important philosopher and to be a significant critic of the view that I would hope myself to make the best case for. Probably...
It's a source of great pride to hear you say that, just because I've always taken yours to be the theory to beat.
Very good. Well, I consider very high praise from a philosopher. So I thank you very much for that. So, talk to you again, and we'll hope that there are other occasions in which we can further explore this rather surprising phenomenon of humans that we are so concerned, it seems, with asking moral questions. Take care.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Bye.
Right, bye. Okay.